They say the brain is the most complex mystery in the human body. But after what I experienced, I'm convinced there are parts of it no one fully understands. I'm a neurologist. I've been studying the brain for over a decade. I've treated strokes, epilepsy, tumors, and diseases that unravel the mind in ways most people can't imagine. But nothing prepared me for the case I'm about to tell you, my most impossible case, the one that still keeps me awake at night. It started on a cold, quiet evening in the hospital. Most patients were stable or recovering. The usual hum of machines and soft footsteps filled the halls. I was ready to call it a night when a nurse called me about an emergency. A man had been admitted with symptoms that didn't make sense: sudden memory loss, confusion, headaches. But his scans and tests showed nothing unusual. When I met him, the first thing I noticed was his eyes, wide, alert, but haunted. His name was Mark, but I didn't know that at first. What I knew were the stories he told me, stories about places he'd never been, events he shouldn't know about, memories that didn't belong to him. At first, I thought it was some kind of mental disorder, dissociative identity, early dementia, maybe rare epilepsy affecting his memory. But every test I ran came back normal. MRI scans showed no lesions or tumors. EEGs were clean. Blood work was clear. Psychological evaluations didn't reveal psychosis. Yet Mark kept describing things that defied logic. He spoke of voices, not hallucinations but clear warnings. Voices that guided him, sometimes scared him. He talked about dreams that felt more real than waking life. Dreams about events in the future, places he had never visited but described in vivid detail. I checked his stories against facts. Some of the places he mentioned were real, even specific rooms and buildings. The dates and times matched events he claimed to have seen. How was that possible? I began doubting my own understanding of the brain. I spoke with my colleagues. Some thought I was chasing shadows. Focus on what you can measure, they said. Others suggested psychiatric evaluation. But Mark wasn't psychotic. He was terrified of these experiences. One night, as I was alone in my office reviewing his files, I heard something, faint whispers, soft enough to doubt, but unmistakable. My heart raced. Was I hearing voices? Or was something else happening? I told myself it was exhaustion, long hours, stress. But deep down I knew it was more. The impossible was seeping into my reality. The lines between science and the unexplained were blurring. This isn't just a medical case. It's a story about the mind, memory, and something beyond. Something I can't fully explain. Something that still haunts me. After that first meeting with Mark, I knew I was dealing with something far beyond the usual neurological puzzles. His symptoms didn't fit any textbook, and his experiences felt more like something out of a thriller than a medical case. But the reality was, he was sitting right there in front of me, confused, scared, and desperate for answers. Mark's memory problems were unlike anything I'd ever seen. He wasn't just forgetting recent events or struggling with names. Instead, he described whole episodes from his life that never actually happened, or at least never happened to him. He would recall conversations he had never had, places he claimed to have visited, and even specific people he said he knew, but no one else could confirm any of it. One afternoon, Mark said something that made my skin crawl. He told me about a dream he had the night before, where he was standing in an unfamiliar hallway. The walls were cold and made of stone, lit only by flickering lights. At the end of the corridor, he saw a door, slightly ajar. Behind that door was a voice, calling his name. He described the voice as familiar yet distant, and warned that something terrible was about to happen. I tried to reassure him, saying it was probably just a bad dream, a side effect of stress or medication. But when I asked him what he thought the voice meant, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I don't know, but I think it's real." That's when I started paying closer attention. I arranged for around-the-clock monitoring. Nurses were instructed to keep detailed notes, and cameras recorded Mark's room at all hours. We ran a battery of tests, everything from advanced brain scans to psychological evaluations, but the results all came back normal. Yet Mark's behavior became stranger. He began having sudden episodes of disorientation, sometimes lasting minutes, where he seemed to slip away entirely. In these moments, he would mumble unintelligible phrases, or stare blankly at a spot in the room, eyes wide but unfocused. And when the episodes ended, he was usually unable to recall what had happened. It was like he was trapped between two worlds. One night, I was called urgently to Mark's room. He was in a panic, pacing back and forth, sweating profusely despite the cold temperature in the ward. The nurses said he'd been muttering to himself for hours, seemingly trying to make sense of something only he could hear. As I entered, Mark stopped. He looked at me with a mix of fear and pleading. "They're coming," he whispered. "The shadows, they're closer than ever." I asked him to explain, but he could only describe feelings, a sense of being watched, of danger lurking just out of sight. It was as though invisible eyes were tracking his every move. That night, as I left the ward, a chill crept down my spine. The hospital felt different, colder, quieter. I brushed it off as fatigue. But in the following days, strange things started happening to me. I began hearing faint whispers when I was alone. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision. Objects in my office seemed to move slightly when I wasn't looking. At first, I dismissed it as stress, exhaustion, but it became harder to ignore. I started to question everything I thought I knew about the brain, about consciousness, about reality itself. Was Mark's condition some rare neurological disorder? Or was it something else? Something unexplainable? Determined to find answers, I dove deeper into research. I scoured medical journals, fringe science articles, even occult texts. I was searching for anything that might shed light on Mark's condition. In the process, I stumbled upon a handful of obscure cases. Scattered around the world, patients who described similar experiences, voices predicting future events, memories that didn't belong to them, episodes of slipping into alternate realities. These cases were rare, often dismissed by mainstream medicine, but they shared eerie similarities with Mark's symptoms. I realized I was at the edge of something much bigger, a world where science and the supernatural intersected in ways I never imagined. One afternoon, while reviewing Mark's EEG readings, I noticed subtle spikes, tiny bursts of activity, in regions of his brain responsible for memory and perception, but in patterns unlike anything I'd seen. It was as if his brain was firing in sync with something outside the normal range of human experience. Could it be possible that Mark's mind was somehow tuned into another dimension? Or was his brain creating these experiences as a form of self-protection? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that I couldn't ignore what was happening, and I couldn't leave Mark to face it alone. As the days passed, Mark's situation became more and more unsettling, not just for him, but for everyone around him. The hospital staff started whispering about the strange things they saw. Doors opening by themselves, cold spots in the hallway, lights flickering without explanation. Some nurses refused to work the night shift on Mark's ward. Mark himself became a shell of the man I first met. His eyes, once haunted but alert, now seemed distant, hollow. He rarely spoke unless prompted. And even then, his words were slow, careful, as if he was weighing each syllable against an invisible burden. One night, Mark grabbed my hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. "They're here," he whispered. I asked him who they were, but he only shook his head. "This isn't soon enough." I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, the product of exhaustion or medication. But deep down, I was starting to feel it too. The weight of something unseen pressing down on the hospital. Late one evening, I stayed behind after my rounds to review Mark's latest scans. The hospital was unusually quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed softly. The only sound was the rhythmic beep of the monitors. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. Emergency backup lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, calling my name. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my phone, using it as a flashlight. When the beam finally cut through the dark, I saw Mark sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide open, staring at a spot just beyond the door. "Do you see them?" he asked. "Phew," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "The shadows," he whispered. "They watch, they wait." I wanted to reassure him, but honestly, I was struggling to keep my own fear at bay. That night, I left the hospital shaken, and I couldn't sleep. The whispering voices followed me home. Fragments of words, warnings, these names I didn't even recognize. Was my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there truly something lurking just beyond the veil of reality? Determined to understand, I reached out to experts beyond my own field. Parapsychologists, neurologists who studied rare brain phenomena, even a few occult researchers. Most of them were skeptical, warned me to be careful, that I might be venturing into dangerous territory. But a few told me about similar cases. Patients who seemed to bridge worlds, their minds acting as conduits for something greater and darker. I began to suspect Mark's brain wasn't just failing, it was connecting to something beyond this world. One evening, Mark showed me a journal he'd been keeping. Drawings, notes, cryptic messages. Pages filled with sketches of shadowy figures, strange symbols, maps of places that didn't exist anywhere on record. One note read, "The veil is thin. They cross when the night is darkest. Beware the silence." Reading those words sent a chill down my spine. I realized this was no longer just a medical mystery. It was a story about the fragile boundary between our world and something else. Something ancient. Something unknowable. And Mark was caught in the middle. I promised myself I would find a way to help him, no matter what it took. But the deeper I dug, the more I felt myself slipping into the same darkness. The impossible case was no longer just Mark's. It was mine too. As Mark's condition worsened, so did the atmosphere around him. Hospital staff grew uneasy, whispering rumors of strange happenings, equipment malfunctioning without cause, fleeting shadows in the corners of their eyes, and an unshakable sense of dread clinging to the ward like a thick fog. Then one night, Mark's behavior hit a breaking point. I was called urgently to his room. When I got there, he was sitting at the edge of his bed, eyes wide, trembling, like he was trying to hold back a storm inside him. "They're coming," he said breathlessly. "The door, it's opening." I asked, "What door?" But he didn't answer. He just stared past me, like he was watching something I couldn't see. I tried to calm him, but his fear was contagious. For the first time, I felt it too. A cold, pressing presence in the room. Something unseen, yet overwhelming. Over the next few days, his episodes became more intense. He'd slip into trance-like states, reciting cryptic phrases in languages I didn't recognize. Nurses began reporting hearing disembodied voices, sometimes pleading, sometimes warning. One afternoon, while reviewing his latest scans, I noticed something new. A faint anomaly deep in his temporal lobe. Barely visible, but persistent. It hadn't been there before. Could this be the key? Was this the source of everything? I consulted a neuroimaging specialist. He said anomalies like this could indicate an unusual connection between brain regions. One's responsible for memory, perception, and consciousness. But could that explain the supernatural parts? The voices? The predictions? That night in my office, I was buried in Mark's records. Exhaustion was pulling me under, but I couldn't stop. And then, the lights flickered. The temperature dropped sharply. And I heard it again. A whisper. But clear. My name. A chill ran through me. I was no longer an observer. I was involved. The impossible had crossed into my reality. The next morning, I went to Mark's room, determined to find answers. He was awake, calmer but distant. He looked straight at me and said, "They don't want you to leave. They want to keep you here." "Who?" I asked, heart pounding. "The shadows. The watchers between worlds. They feed on fear, and they grow stronger when you believe." I wanted to dismiss it as madness, but part of me knew better. Days later, Mark vanished. Security cameras showed nothing. The footage was corrupted. We found him hours later, outside the hospital, confused, and with no memory of how he got there. That was when I realized the truth. Mark's mind was not only haunted, but tethered to something beyond comprehension, and I was dragged in alongside him. After Mark's disappearance and sudden return, things only got stranger. His episodes became more frequent, more severe. He was no longer just a patient, he was a doorway, a living bridge between our world and something far darker. The hospital began to feel like a place trapped in a nightmare. Staff reported cold spots, unexplained noises. Some swore they saw shadowy figures lurking just beyond their vision. The tension was palpable, and fear spread quietly like a virus. One night, I was paged urgently to Mark's room. He was in the middle of one of his episodes, eyes rolled back, whispering words I didn't understand. His body trembled uncontrollably, and then he suddenly cried out, "They're here! The Watchers have come!" The medical team rushed to stabilize him. I stood back, heart pounding. This wasn't a medical crisis. It was something else entirely. After he recovered consciousness, Mark looked at me with pleading eyes. "You have to listen," he said. "They're coming for all of us. The veil between worlds is weakening." I wanted to dismiss his words as delirium, but I couldn't. There was an urgency, a truth, in his voice I couldn't ignore. Determined to help him, I reached out to researchers, people who specialized in rare neurological phenomena. Some suggested Mark's brain was experiencing a form of temporal lobe epilepsy, which can cause hallucinations and feelings of déjà vu. But this didn't explain the voices predicting future events, or the strange occurrences around the hospital. One researcher mentioned cases where brain injury patients seemed to exhibit clairvoyant abilities, seeing events before they happened. He called it the mysterious side of the temporal lobe. Intrigued and desperate, I dove deeper into these reports. The more I read, the more I realized Mark was no ordinary patient. He was connected to something vast and terrifying. One evening, while alone in the hospital, I found myself drawn to Mark's room. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't describe. I sat beside him as he whispered stories of another realm, a place where time folded and shadows moved with purpose. He told me about the veil, a fragile barrier separating our reality from the unknown, and he warned that the veil was thinning. As he spoke, I felt a cold draft brush past me, though no windows were open. The hospital's lights flickered again, and for a moment, everything went dark. When the lights returned, Mark was staring at me with a look of desperate urgency. "We don't have much time," he said. I realized then that my journey had become something far beyond medicine. I was caught in a web of the unexplained, and there was no turning back. The hospital had changed, not just in atmosphere, but in the very air we breathed. Something unseen was creeping into our reality. And it wasn't just Mark who felt it. I did too, in ways I couldn't ignore any longer. It started subtly, with small things. The flicker of lights when I walked into a room. Whispers at the edge of hearing, just beyond the threshold of understanding. Shadows that seemed to move with purpose, never fully revealing themselves. I found myself questioning everything I believed, about the brain, about consciousness, about reality itself. One evening, after a long day reviewing Mark scans, I sat alone in my office, exhausted, but unable to stop thinking about the case. I was scrolling through some old notes when I noticed something peculiar, a pattern in Mark's brain activity that seemed to echo a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, but irregular. Curious, I decided to map it out across days and nights, looking for any connection to his episodes. What I found chilled me to the bone. The spikes in brain activity coincided with moments when Mark claimed to hear voices, to see visions, or to remember impossible memories. But more than that, the spikes also matched strange events happening in the hospital. Unexplained power outages, strange noises in empty corridors, And even the moment when Mark had disappeared and reappeared was as if his brain was somehow linked to the disturbances around us. I started sharing my findings with a small circle of trusted colleagues, neurologists, psychologists, even physicists. Some listened with interest, others with skepticism. One physicist suggested something that sounded like science fiction, that Mark's brain might be acting as a quantum receiver, tuned to frequencies outside normal human perception. That what he experienced wasn't hallucination or illness, but the connection to another dimension, another reality. I wanted to believe that wasn't true. But as days passed, the evidence kept mounting. Mark's journal grew thicker, his drawings more detailed, his warnings more urgent. One page caught my eye. Written in shaky handwriting was a phrase that sent a shiver down my spine. The crossing point is near. The veil will tear. I asked Mark what he meant, but he only looked away, afraid to speak. Then, one night, the hospital's power went out completely. Emergency systems kicked in, casting a dim red glow over the halls. I was on my way to check on Mark when I heard a low hum, like a vibration beneath the floor. The air was thick and heavy. In his room, Mark was sitting upright, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open, wide with terror. "They're coming," he gasped. "The Watchers. The ones who cross when the veil breaks." Before I could respond, a shadow flickered across the wall, quick, indistinct, but unmistakable. I froze. The impossible was no longer just a theory. It was happening. The hospital felt alive, as if caught between two worlds. And Mark was at the center. I realized then that my role had changed. I was no longer just a doctor. I was a guardian, a witness to something ancient and terrifying. But how could I protect a man whose mind was the gateway? And how could I protect myself from what was coming next? That night, sleep was impossible. I lay awake, haunted by voices, shadows, and questions without answers. Was this the end of what we understand as reality? Or just the beginning of something new? The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and creeping dread. Mark's condition deteriorated rapidly, and the hospital felt less like a place of healing and more like a gateway to something we couldn't control. I watched as the man who had once been so full of fear turned into someone almost possessed. His eyes glazed over, his voice distant, repeating warnings I didn't understand. Staff avoided his room. Some called in sick. The whispers of shadowy figures lurking in the halls became too common to ignore. One night, I found Mark standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. He turned to me and said, "They're coming, doctor. The veil is thinning faster than I feared." I asked him what he meant. He spoke of a force, a gathering darkness that was crossing from one world into ours. A darkness that fed on fear and uncertainty. "Can't you stop it?" I asked. Mark shook his head. "I don't know if anyone can." Determined to help, I began researching ancient texts and forgotten myths, searching for anything that could explain the thinning veil Mark described. I discovered stories from cultures around the world, legends of spirits, watchers, and otherworldly beings crossing into our reality during times of great cosmic imbalance. Could Mark's brain truly be a conduit for such forces? The thought terrified me. One evening, I gathered a small team of experts, neurologists, parapsychologists, even a medium, hoping to find answers or at least some understanding. Together, we monitored Mark's brain activity, which now showed erratic spikes corresponding to his episodes of vision and warning. The medium told us that Mark was being used as a channel, a vessel through which the shadows tried to communicate. She warned that unless the veil was somehow reinforced, these entities would soon cross fully into our world, with consequences we couldn't imagine. The hospital's power failures and strange occurrences were signs of this impending breach. We needed a plan, fast. Mark's own warnings became more desperate. He begged me to help him close the door before it was too late. But what door? And how could a neurologist possibly stop forces beyond science? I felt powerless, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. And yet, I couldn't walk away. This case was no longer just a mystery. It was a race against time. One night, as I sat beside Mark, holding his hand, I heard the whispers again, soft but clear, as if coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. They called my name. I felt the weight of the unseen pressing down, demanding attention. I realized then that the impossible had become personal. I was no longer an outsider looking in. I was part of this story, and the shadows were waiting. The night was thick with silence, but inside the hospital, everything was on edge. Mark's warnings had become urgent whispers echoing through the corridors, and the shadows seemed to grow bolder, pressing closer to the edge of reality. I sat by Mark's bedside, his frail hand trembling in mine. His eyes, once haunted and wide, now held a strange calmness, as if he had accepted what was coming. "We don't have much time," he said softly. "The veil will tear tonight." I had spent weeks trying to find a solution, consulting experts from every field, neurology, parapsychology, ancient lore, but answers were scarce, and hope was thinner still. We devised a plan, a desperate attempt to strengthen the fragile barrier between worlds. Using a combination of technology and ritual suggested by the medium, we hoped to close whatever doorway Mark's mind had opened. The hospital's power flickered, lights dimming as if the building itself was holding its breath. We set up sensors, machines designed to monitor the unknown energies that seemed to flood Mark's room. The atmosphere was charged with electricity and fear. As the ritual began, Mark's voice grew stronger, chanting words in a language none of us understood. The shadows danced on the walls, shifting and twisting as if fighting against the barrier we were trying to rebuild. Suddenly, the monitors went wild, flashing with erratic patterns, and the air grew unbearably cold. A deep, resonating hum filled the room, shaking the very foundation of the hospital. I felt the presence, heavy, ancient, and indifferent. The shadows moved closer, reaching out like dark tendrils seeking to break free. Mark's body convulsed, caught between worlds. I held on to him, whispering reassurances, though I feared it was too late. Then, with a blinding flash of light and a sound like tearing fabric, the veil snapped shut. The shadows vanished. The temperature rose. The monitors stabilized. Mark lay still, his eyes closed but peaceful. We had done it, or so we hoped. In the days that followed, the hospital returned to normal. The whispers stopped. The strange occurrences ceased. Mark's condition improved slightly, though he remained weak and exhausted. I often wondered what exactly had happened that night, whether we had truly closed the doorway or simply pushed back a darkness that would return someday. But one thing was clear: the human mind holds secrets we are only beginning to understand. And sometimes, the impossible is closer than we think. As for me, the case of Mark changed everything. My beliefs, my understanding of science, and my own place in the world. I still hear the faintest whisper now and then, a reminder of the thin line between reality and the unknown. And I know that some doors, once opened, are never fully closed.